I will get this. And that's what I call magic. Wait. We'll get there. What's going on, everybody? So today we'll be talking about Lightroom. And what is Lightroom? Well, it's an application where you can edit your photos, and almost all the professional photographers use Lightroom, unless you're one of the guys that use Photoshop. But anyway, so today we'll be talking about the basics of Lightroom, where I'm going to show you how to import, export, what settings to use when you export, how to make sure they look good for the gram, to make it look shiny and all that kind of stuff. And then we're just going to talk about all those little crazy sliders that I had a lot of trouble with when I first started. Actually, funny story, I didn't use Lightroom until 3 months into my photography journey. But it can sound super confusing, it can sound super difficult. Let's get into the basics and get started. So let's hit up Lightroom. You should see something like this once you've hit the development tab, and if you don't see anything like this, then you've got to go down to your Adobe Creative Cloud and hit Lightroom Classic CC, download that, even start the trial if you need to. But today we're going to be talking about this tab here. There's so much to cover in Lightroom as basics, so we're going to make this a 3-part series, but today we're just going to cover the temperature, the tone, the presence, and the HSL, hue, saturation, and luminance. This was actually a photo that I shot in Norway. This is the before, and that's the after. So once we're done with all our basics and our editing, how to edit tutorial, we should be getting you editing just like this. Right, so let's start with the temperature. Now, it is very important, and I say very important, to always shoot in RAW format. And why, you might ask? Because if you don't shoot in RAW format, one, when you come down here, you won't be able to enable profile corrections, and what this does is it smooths out the image for you, and it decides what lens profile you've used. So what model, what make, and what basic profile you've used. Also, if you don't shoot in RAW, you won't be able to change the temperature slider and add tint to it. I've started here by adding temp, but I hardly use any tint. Anyway, so what is the temperature slider? Basically, it's as simple as it looks. It's either cold temperature or you're adding warm temperature, and that's all there really is to it. If you want to go for a really warm vibe, then you'd slide up to the right. But if you want to go for a really cold vibe, then obviously you'd slide it to the left. Depending on what photo you have, you would adjust it accordingly. The tint is self-explanatory as well. If you want to add some green tint to your photo, the more you slide it to the left, the greener the photo gets. Now this could be quite cool if you do a bit of blue and a tiny bit of green. You can see just the difference that it makes. The photo gets greener, greener, and greener. Or you can slide all the way to the right, and it's got that kind of like super cool purple vibe to it. Right, I know what you're thinking. What on earth are these red things going on here? So before I confuse you even more, these red things are the black and the white clippings. So if I take these off, you don't see how dark it gets, you don't see how bright it gets. But if I put them on, boom and boom, and I slide it up, I really want to increase the exposure, Lightroom's going to start saying, hey now buddy, slow down, you're getting too bright in this area. So you can see the red, the little patch of red here, telling you it's way too bright, it's way too overexposed. So this is a super handy tool, and all you're going to do is make sure that the white little box is around it, and then you're good to go. So I like to keep them all on, just because it's super helpful to know when I've gone a bit over the top. Right, so let's put that back to 0.8. Okay, so now exposure. Most of you should know what exposure is by now. Basically, exposure is the amount of light that you're adding or taking away from the photo. So like in photography, if you have a slower shutter speed, you're letting more light into the photo. But if you have a faster shutter speed, you're letting less light into the photo. So it's fairly straightforward. If we take away light, the photo gets darker. If we add light, again, we don't want to add too much light or else those red things come up, then we're obviously adding light. So sliding to the right, sliding to the left is taking away light, sliding to the right is adding light. Then we move down to contrast. What is contrast?
When working with the contrast slider and pushing it to the right, located in the basic panel in Lightroom, the adjustments darken the darker midtones and lighten the lighter midtones across the entire image. When the slider is pushed to the right, contrast between the lighter and the darker midtones increases.
So basically what our good friend at Google tried to tell us was, if you slide the slider to the right, you're darkening the tones in the image, the black tones in the image. And if you slide it to the left, you're brightening up the whiter tones in the image. It's also good to know that when sliding the slider to the right, you're adding a tiny bit of saturation. And when you're sliding the slider to the left, you're also taking away a bit of the saturation. So as you can see, the more I slide to the left, the more like foggy-ish and less saturated it becomes. But if I slide it all the way to the right, it becomes much, much darker and it all gets a ton more saturated. So that is contrast. Not your best friend, but the more you work with him, the better friends you'll become. Right, so highlights. No, not the highlights you're thinking of. These are photography highlights. Highlights that happen inside of a photo. So for example, let's take it back to 0 here. Highlights are the brightest part of an image, and just like in your hair, the highlights would resemble the brightest parts of your hair, right? So highlights are the brightest part of your image. So if we slide it to the left, you can see all the detail that's coming back, all the lost detail that's coming back in the sky. So you bring in all of that back in. But if you slide it all the way to the right, you start to lose the detail in the sky. It gets brighter and brighter and brighter, and you can even see the red here start to increase as well, because we're brightening the brightest parts of the image. Slide to the left, you're bringing back all the lost details, all the brightness in that image that would be lost, you're bringing all of that back. Usually you'd put it down to like -80, so you're bringing back as much detail as possible. Don't put it to 100 because sometimes that's a bit too intense, but just leave it there. So now we're on to shadows. So as you can see in that photo, there was the brighter parts, which would have been the highlights, and then there's the shadow of that person, which is the darkest parts of the image. And that's exactly what the shadows are. They're the darkest parts of the image. So these would be the shadows of the image. This would be a part of the shadow of the image. Anything that's relatively dark in the image would be a part of the shadows of the image. If we bring it back to 0, we can see exactly what happens if we increase the darkest parts of the image. Now focus on the trees here. Look what happens when we increase the shadows of the trees. You can slowly see that the trees become brighter and brighter and brighter. And even here, it also becomes much, much brighter, because again, this is a part of the darkest part of the image. Not all of it, not these red parts, but some of the image is part of the darkest part of the image. So if you have really dark parts of the image, then you would slide the slider to the right to give that a bit more light. So as you can see, the church here is also starting to illuminate a little bit. And effectively, what you're doing is you're just adding light to the darkest parts of the image. Again, if you go to the other side, so you can see the church becomes even darker and the trees have become darker as well, and the whole image is becoming darker again. And that's because the shadows, again, resemble the darkest parts of the image. I know I've said it so many times, but I've realized repetition definitely helps. Whites and blacks. These are fairly straightforward. These are just the white color in the image and the black color in the image. So if you're not satisfied with the shadows, then you want to bring it down. So whites and blacks, you can see here, this is fairly straightforward. This is just the white part of the image and the black parts of the image. And basically here, you're just clipping them. What do I mean by clipping? Well, it's sort of manipulating, but not really manipulating. It's just adding light or taking away light from the whites. So here I'm making the whites brighter. As you can see, Lightroom's telling us again, don't go too bright, don't go too bright. That's why the red pops up. But if we take away the light, you can start to see that the snow and the white areas become much, much darker. So again, super bright and much, much darker. And the same thing goes for the blacks. If I take away the blacks, you can see all the information with the blacks in it. So basically almost the whole image starts to shift towards the right. So you can see here by the histogram, if we're clipping the blacks, it starts to shift more towards the blacks. But if we shift it towards the right, it moves towards the white section here. So you're basically just manipulating how much of the blacks there is in the photos and how much of the whites you want in the photo. Boom, see, we're crushing it already down to presence, right? So clarity. Clarity is essentially what you might think it is. It's how clear the photo becomes, how sharp the photo becomes. Now, if you're loving your HDR vibe and you really want to go HDR, then I would say pop it all the way down towards the right-hand side. But as you can see, if you add more clarity, things become brighter. The snow becomes brighter. So as you add more clarity, you're also adding a bit more light. In saying that, if you go all the way to the left, you're taking away light and you're making it super dreamy, almost like a photo in Winter in the Wonderland, or what's it called? Alice in the Wonderland. That's what it's called, not Winter in the Wonderland. Anyway, so this looks super cool, super dreamy, and that's because you've been taking all the clarity away from the photo, in result making it more of a blurry, dreamy sort of landscape shot, which is also cool. But if you love the whole HDR vibe, then you want to slide it to the right. Now, Dehaze is a tricky one. When I first started, I never used Dehaze because I was like, what is Dehaze? It sounds super cool, but I'm not even going to use it ever. Anyway, so when I figured out what Dehaze was, a quick search on Google reminded me that Dehaze was basically just, if you have fog, if you have anything that looks a bit hazy, then you want to slide that slider to the right and it will take away all the fog. I know this is not a good example with this photo because there's no actual fog, but also what it does do is whilst it takes away the fog, it also adds saturation and depth and just a pow into your image, right? So if we're adding more and more dehaze, you can see that the whole image gets more and more and more saturated. It also sort of becomes more shiny. It just has more of a like oomph to it. So only add a very, very tiny bit of dehaze if you actually have no fog inside your photo. But if you want to add fog into your photo when there is none, you can slide it all the way to the left. And now you can see you're adding light because the reds are back. Hello, how are you doing? But you're also adding a lot of smog and a lot of fog. You can see in the trees here, it started to create a little bit of a panel of fog there. And even on the road, it starts to get foggy as well. So it's up to you what you want to do with this slider. But I've realized that if you put it on like lakes or something, it can get that really like smooth and shiny sort of like vibe to it. So I mostly use it on like lakes, water, and anything that I want to really like have a nice clear presence to it. Move it down to vibrance. Now vibrance is essentially just a different way of saying saturation. You're adding more presence towards your photo. You're making it pop more. You're getting that kind of like wow factor to your photo through saturations. So if I go like this, bam, look at that, so much saturation. But if I go like this, bam, it's basically a black and white. So essentially, it's another tab of just increasing the saturation without having to go down to the HSL slider and having to do it all manually. So the more you increase it, the more it saturates, and the more you decrease it, the less of the saturation you get. Saturation here is fairly self-explanatory. All the colors are getting deeper, getting a more intensive look of what the color is. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wow, this is just too much for me. My head is about to explode, like... Yeah, I was there as well 3 years ago. When I first started using Lightroom, I was like, what are these sliders and how do I even make this go up? And I had a massive love-hate relationship. I used to get so angry. I was like, you're not doing what I want you to do. But with a ton of practice and going out to take photos, coming back and then looking at the YouTube tutorials whilst I was editing, that helped me so much, because if I didn't know what I was doing, I could go back and forth, so I'd go to minute 3, or if I didn't know something in minute 1, I'd go back and alright, let's start again. So sometimes I'd be like, how did he get this green to look so much darker? So I would go back and then I'd look at it, and then I'd try to implement it myself, and then I'd understand, oh, okay, so he pushed the hue slider, or he darkened the saturation, or darkened the luminance. So the more you practice in Lightroom, the better you get, and that's just a basic rule for everything. Right, enough talking with that one. Let's get back to the basics and just crush this Lightroom. Alright, back to the last one, HSL, which means hue, saturation, and luminance. Now, I've always had trouble with this guy right here, hue. At first I was just like, hue? As in hue? No, it can't be hue as in hue. So then I went back to my good old trusty friend.
Hue. Green, orange, yellow, and blue. Each of these is a hue, a color or a shade that is true. A rainbow shows the melting of one hue into another, from red to violet, and all shades between. The noun hue means both a color and a shade of a color.
So what I think our trusty friend at Google is trying to say is that all these colors have different shades. So red has its own shade, orange has its own shade, yellow has its own shade, and green has its own shade, and so on. So if we touch the red here, we move it to the left, we're going to get a sort of like pink shade of red, and you can see the sky changing quite a bit there. And if we move it to the right here, we can see it's adopting a sort of like almost orangey shade of the color. Same would go for aqua or blue. If we move it to the right, it adopts a more darker bluish form of the color blue, almost even a purplish view of the blue. And if we slide to the left, it also becomes like this really cool sort of like light blue aqua looking thing. So that's essentially what hue is. It's just different shades of the color. I know what you're thinking, guys. Wow, Nick, you've completely ruined this photo. But with one click of a button, we can get it back. Anyway, so it's up to you really on what you want to change when it comes to the hue. Experiment, get fancy, get funny, do whatever you like to your photo. At the end of the day, it's your creation, it's your art. But before we move on to saturation, I have to share this little tip with you, because when I figured this out, it literally blew my mind. So if you come over here and you press this little guy, it's just in the corner, and you know, you miss it all the time. But if you press this, it says adjust the hue by dragging in the photo. Now, if you click this guy and then you hover over to different colors, you might think, right, this is obviously white, or this is definitely white. But then you hover over and it's just like, but it's blue, it's saying it's blue. And if you hover over to here, this is blue too. If you hover over to here, this is orange. Okay, that sort of makes sense, but I think this is more of a like reddish brown. There you go, makes sense as well. But sometimes you're trying to adjust the color, like let's think that we thought this was green, but it's actually blue. So you're like, I'm adjusting the greens, but why is nothing changing? And that's because this is actually the color blue. So this is a super handy tip just to find out what the color is in the photo, so you don't spend hours and hours adjusting a color that's not actually in that photo, or a color that's not being representative of what you're trying to change. Down to saturation now. So as I said before, with vibrance you can just add saturation to the whole photo, but if you want to get creative and if you want to play with the different types of colors inside the photo, so let's say you want red. I love the color red, so pooh, I just want to smash that saturation up. There we go. And I really hate the color blue, so I just want to like, no, go away. Aqua, go away too. Do you see how, not that I've destroyed the photo, but do you see how I've added more intensity to the color red here? Do you see how I've completely almost taken away the blue color here? Now obviously you're not going to do something like this. Obviously you're going to be smart, you want to make this as nice as possible, right? But for the point of this demonstration, it's just to show that all these different colors can have a higher intensity, or they can have a lower intensity by either adding extra green or taking away the color of the green. So now down to luminance. As the word would suggest, to illuminate, luminance is adding light. So if we take the reds here and we push them to the right here, we're basically adding light towards the red, which makes it much softer, calmer, and it's not so like intense as you might think. So the more light we add, the less of the red is actually apparent in the photo. But if we take it away, you can start to see, ooh, the red's really coming at us, and now that's just a really strong dark red. So again, if we bring it up, it's more soft, less vibrant, but if we bring it down, it's really there, really in the photo. You can do some really awesome stuff, for instance, with the blues. If you bring down the blues, you can see how it basically just almost makes it like a midnight sky, like completely dark and completely night. But it also affects the bottom here, and it just looks completely terrible. So remember not to just do it one way, and remember not just to do it the other way. Experiment. Take your time in learning what's the best settings, and that's basically what I did. I just fiddled around with all of them once I knew what they were, and I figured out what the best exact figure or number was for that exact photo. But again, luminance is adding light or taking away light from the color. Saturation is adding intensity or depth towards the color, either taking the color completely away or really intensifying the color. And hue, as we now know, are the different shades of the color. So again, for red, it's a different shades of red, from almost a pink looking thing to an orange looking thing. And that covers all the basics that you need to know to get started in Lightroom. We made it, guys. We made it through the tutorial. I know it was tough. I know you might have gone angry because you didn't know what we were doing. I was there as well. But you've conquered your first tutorial and you're on your way to become a Lightroom master. Yes, a Lightroom sensei. Anyways, I hope you've loved this video as much as I've loved making it. If you did like it, then please hit that thumbs up button, pop that subscriber button, just go pew, and I will see you in the next video.